Okay, we're good over here. Okay. And everyone else is good? Great. Caroline and I affirm, and contention one is rural hospital closures. Medicare for All would save rural healthcare two ways, and the first is direct investment. Medicare for All includes direct payments to hospitals on the brink of closure. Callback 19 reports that 113 rural hospitals have closed their doors, leaving more than 30 million Americans away from critical care. And Medicare for All bill includes funding to invest directly in areas without enough health coverage, including rural and low-income urban areas. The second is strengthening balance sheets. Rural hospitals are overwhelmed with patients who can't pay for treatments, and the hospitals themselves end up footing the bills. Archer 20 finds that mountains of research show that rural Americans with low incomes and chronic conditions often cannot afford needed care or coverage. Rural hospitals are not reimbursed for much of the care they deliver, and many of them cannot generate the revenue needed to serve their communities. Nearly 4 in 10 rural hospitals are unprofitable. M4A ensures rural hospitals are properly compensated for the care they deliver, and guaranteed health coverage would ensure that rural Americans can get the health care they need. The first impact is mortality. Closures have been heightened by COVID. Ballantine 20 finds that the pandemic erupted at an awful time for communities trying to fill healthcare gaps. The worst is yet to come if something's not done to stabilize the safety net. And hospital closures increase mortality. LaPointe 19 explains that rural closures increase mortality by 9% in the surrounding area. The second impact is rural economies. COVID has devastated economies predicated on farming and manufacturing. Hospitals are economic lifelines in poor communities. Paschal 20 reports that the novel strain of the coronavirus continues to hit rural southern communities. It could be catastrophic for the long-term physical and economic health of their communities. Rural communities are poor overall, and COVID has the potential to overwhelm hospitals that already operate within thin margins or at a loss as they try to figure out how to stabilize a workforce at higher risk of contracting the virus. Contention 2 is the economy. The first link is wages. Medicare for All would increase salaries, as Bivens finds that Medicare for All could increase wages and salaries for U.S. workers by reducing employer costs for health insurance, freeing up fiscal space to invest in wages instead. If employers spend health cost savings on wages and salaries, the wages of American workers would be $400 billion higher. Second is creating high-quality jobs. Medicare for All would create millions of new jobs and skyrocket economic growth. Direct 20 indicates that more than 20 recent studies concluded that a Medicare for All system would cost less than the status quo. Fundamental health reform like that, like M4A, guarantees access to insurance regardless of one's current job status, a key part of making transitions easier. Expanded access to healthcare could increase demand for health services by $300 billion annually and would subsequently require 17 million new positions. The third is consumer spending. Con 20 finds that unregulated markets allow monopoly providers to raise prices to levels virtually unrestrained by the inelastic demand for life-saving products. By lowering the cost of healthcare and allowing the transfer of compensation from dollars into wages, M4A would produce the largest increase in take-home pay in American history. With more money in their pockets, consumer spending would increase, encouraging more investment and faster economic growth. Current COVID stimulus checks are ineffective and just for show. Kuttner 20 finds that the $1 trillion stimulus package proposed by the Trump administration will be woefully insufficient. No measure is remotely sufficient given the scale and rate of likely economic collapse. However, Medicare can fill the gap, as Dudzik finds that the Medicare proposal should be a centerpiece of the next round of emergency relief legislation. M4A would be a huge economic stimulus and an economic shot in the arm for all working families, both employed and unemployed, which is why we affirm.
Are y'all sending your case in the email chain? Okay, cool.
Just let me know when you get it, but it should be sent now.
Yeah, we're just waiting on it over here. Okay, we got it. Is everyone ready? Okay. We negate. Contention 1 is ending pharmaceutical philanthropy. McNeil 19 of New York Times writes that once demonized as immoral profiteers, many of the world's biggest 20 pharmaceutical companies now boast about how they help the poor countries. Spice 18 of Motley Fool writes that biopharmaceutical companies lead all other industries in corporate giving by donating 19.4% of pre-tax profits to charitable organizations, 90% of contributions in the form of product donations. Drug companies are able to do this because Mel of the University of Minnesota 18 explains that because of high American prices, pharmaceutical companies grant price concessions elsewhere, including donation of critical medications to low-income countries. Medicare for All calls for price controls on the cost of drugs. Pseudo-weighted public quantifies that price controls in the largely unregulated U.S. market would greatly reduce revenues by as much as 20.3%. The Economist 19 explains that with price controls, poor countries will no longer get good deals because firms do not have the ability to extract high prices from the U.S. to cover the cost of donations abroad. Moreover, Lanzhou of Finally Center for Global Development adds that price controls lower the probability that new pharmaceuticals reach consumers quickly in lower income countries by 30%. Thus, affirming cuts off the lifeline to millions as companies decrease philanthropy to make up for their budget shortfalls. Taylor Chen quantifies that since 2000, pharmaceutical companies have provided health interventions to 540 million people. Contention 2 is a debt disaster. In order to finance Medicare for All, deficit spending is necessary. Baha's 18 at the George Mason University confirms that doubling all federal individual taxes will be insufficient to fully finance the plan, even under the assumption that payment rates are reduced by over 40% for the treatment of patients now covered by private insurance. Thus, he concludes Medicare for All would increase federal budget commitments by $32.6 trillion during its first 10 years. In order to finance the debt, the American Treasury sells bonds. The flood of bonds will devastate low and middle income countries or LMICs through rising yield rates. Charles finds that emerging markets have $3.9 trillion in debt service due in 2020. And a study by Greenwood of Harvard in 2014 analyzing the historical relationship between the supply of bonds and yield rates in the U.S. since 1916 explains that an increase in supply of bonds raises bond yields, and the effects are stronger during time when investors are more risk averse. Medicare for All would uniquely increase yield rates, as Schrager 19 of course explains. A deficit can be justified for a one-time investment like a useful infrastructure project that pays for itself over time, but starting a new unfunded entitlement program like Medicare for All, which creates a deficit going forward, comes with bigger risks, and thus, as it requires long-term spending, investors need an increased incentive to invest, warranting an increase in yield rates on bonds. When interest rates rise in America, they amplify the debt problems of low and middle income countries. This is because Sester 18 of Foreign Affairs explains the effects of the deficit go beyond the United States. Rising U.S. interest rates make government debt in emerging market countries less attractive, so many governments face higher borrowing costs because LMICs hike interest rates on their bonds in order to compete with safer American bonds. 2011 of IMF quantifies its effect, finding that every 1% increase in debt to GDP ratio in the U.S. results in a 0.1% increase in yield rates in emerging markets. After countries increase their yield rates to compete with U.S. bonds, they have to spend more of their government spending to pay back these high rates. Unfortunately, this risks defaults in their economy because how much MFRA would force them to increase their yields. Walsh in June of the New York Times writes that right now, from Angola to Jamaica to Ecuador to Zambia, the world's poorest countries have had their finances shredded by the global pandemic. Countries owe record amounts of money to investors, and governments are on the hook for billions of dollars in interest. Payments suddenly made more expensive by the volatility in currency markets, and their investors are not in a forgiving mood. The IMF has extended 2 emergency loan programs, and more than 100 countries have applied for loans to avoid imminent default, but much more financial assistance is needed. Increasing bond yields to push these countries over the edge and into default by making interest payments impossible to fulfill. Avoiding debt default is imperative, or to IPS 18 writes that in the event of default, rather than investing in recovery, governments cut social assistance and millions of people push into poverty as a result, as well as cut government education and health spending, increase income inequality, declining access to healthcare, and a rising neonatal mortality. And Jones 16 of Global Justice concludes that in the 80s and 90s, many countries in the global south were hit by a cataclysmic debt crisis. In sub-Saharan Africa, the number of people living in extreme poverty increased by 125 million people. The crisis came after rising U.S. rates in the early 80s. Moreover, debt default dooms LMICs to prolonged economic crisis. Walsh explains to international investors are contraction not allowed to own defaulted bonds. Investors would be forced to sell their bonds, and credit firm ratings would be required to downgrade countries. It would destroy for years to come the market access of those countries. Even if countries narrowly avoid default by spending all money on interest payments, transatlantic explains growing debt payments crowds out discretionary spending in a whole range of areas that already eats up 1/3 of their tax revenue. Low-income countries will be extremely hard-pressed to deal with the worsening debt crisis, the healthcare crisis, and the pandemic, consequently ultimately leading to a fail. To prevent a drug trade-off and a debt disaster, we probably negate. Okay, I just sent the case in the chain.
Okay. We'll start cross when Caroline gets it. Awesome. Can I get first question? Okay. Why does increasing yield rates necessarily increase interest rates?
Oh, in case I used interchangeably, it's yield rates on the bonds and interest rates on the bonds. They're like functionally the same thing, like the synonyms. It's in the argument, like the yield rate on the bond is like the same thing as the interest rate on the bond. Does that make sense?
Then why does increasing the amount of bonds increase interest rates?
Increase the interest rates on the bonds. So there's a couple of pieces of evidence we read in case. So what we explain is that first, Greenwood finds historically, since 1916, every time we increase the supply of bonds, the yields have to increase, especially in times like now when investors are more risk averse. The Schrager evidence finds
but why do they have to increase?
Right. Medicare for all, like in general, yields increase when investors like are not confident in the system, and they increase when there's a risky spending project happen, which is why the Schrager evidence finds that Medicare for all would uniquely increase yield rates because investors would need some sort of incentive to invest in this long-term risky program insofar as it creates a spending deficit every year going forward. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay, can I get a question?
Sure.
So on your rural hospitals argument, how much more money or how much more funding is like needed to like solve the problem? Like what's the bright line?
Well, it's a linear impact, right? To the point where there are a lot of hospitals that are at risk of
It's
closure.
a linear impact. So
More,
like they
more
either stay
funding,
open or they close, right? It's
Excuse
like
me?
kind of binary, right? They either stay open or they close, right?
No, there are lots of hospitals that are operating in the red.
Okay, so they either stay open or and they
No,
don't close,
no,
and
they
they're
just are operating
operating
in the red for a little while and not having high quality services. And we would argue that it's keeping the hospitals that are currently in the red and pushing them back up.
So your argument is not that hospitals close, but the quality of care at hospitals gets worse.
Well, no. Our argument is that hospitals close. Keeping hospitals out of the red keeps them from, but also
you just said the hospitals in the red aren't closing.
No, there are hospitals that exist in the red right now that are not closed, but there are also 113 that are closed.
Right. So what does it take for the hospitals in the red to close?
Like not having enough money to provide care to their patients, but we would say that the government always has an incentive to keep hospitals open and give a large enough lump sum for those hospitals to stay open because they don't want those hospitals to close. So there's no reason why the sum would be too small.
Okay, you can get a question.
Okay, let's talk more specifically about the donations argument. What is the current incentive to donate drugs to low-income countries?
Altruism.
What?
Altruism. Countries like to do things to make them look good.
Okay, why does that go away?
It's not necessarily about incentive though. Our argument is more about capacity. Even though countries and companies have the want to donate drugs to be doers of good, under Medicare for All, with the massive decreases in revenue, they won't have the capacity to do so. We're out of time.
Okay. Is everybody ready? Great. Start their C1 about philanthropy. First, you can turn it, the majority of innovation from the private sector is useless. In fact, government-run institutions do most of the groundbreaking research. As Quickly 18 writes that a huge proportion of research is paid for by the government. Corporations are wary of investing in research that may not yield a profitable drug, so they turn to the NIH to assume the risk. Groundbreaking drugs to treat cancer, mental health, along with vaccines all owe their existence to taxpayer-funded research. The private sector only pays for 1/3 of U.S. biomedical research, and much of that is focused on Me Too drugs, which provide no new benefit compared to products already available. That means the majority of innovative drugs they isolate are coming from the public sector, which will always have an incentive to continue to innovate. They can continue to donate in an app world, but secondly, you can turn it again, setting pharmaceutical prices, increase market sizes. Audi 14, right, says setting prescription drug prices 20% lower than the current list price, but increase the number of users who can afford the drug by 23%. That turns their link because the number of people who can afford the drug goes up by 23%. More people buy the company's product, meaning that their revenue increases, which increases the company's capacity to donate. But third, pharmaceutical companies get massive tax write-offs to provide cheap drugs to LICs. That doesn't go away in an app world. They'll have an incentive to donate drugs no matter what. But then outside of monetary incentive, pharmaceutical companies donate drugs to seem philanthropic, which helps their ability to lobby. Selling at an even greater loss generates that same perception. They'll still donate in an app world. But then remember, in our first contingent, we tell you that by facilitating grants and strengthening balance sheets, Medicare for All would keep rural hospitals afloat. This outweighs their impact for two reasons. First is a prereq. Innovation doesn't matter if there aren't hospitals to give out treatments. They concede in first cross that pharma companies only make profits in the US and make significantly less in LICs. That means if US hospitals aren't facilitating treatments and pharma isn't creating profits, they'll stop producing drugs for LICs too. But then on time frame, COVID had spiraled hospital closures out of control, but the direct investment starts immediately after the passage of Medicare for All. Treatments don't immediately go away. There are already ones currently on the market, but then RC2 short circuits this impact anyway. If the economy tanks, no one's making risky investments in LICs no matter what. But then you can go on to your second contention about the debt. At the top, you can turn it. Streamlining health service is the best way to reduce the debt, as the SLPD writes that the deficit problem is a healthcare problem. The CBO projects that if we continue on our current course, deficits will remain high. It finds that private insurance bureaucracy consumes 31% of every healthcare dollar. Streamlining payment would save more than $400 billion per year, enough to provide comprehensive coverage for all Americans. The best way to seriously address long-term deficits is through a single-payer plan. In 2008, when healthcare costs amounted to 16% of US GDP, Britain was spending 8.7% of its GDP on healthcare, and Canada was spending 10.4%. Both nations have single-payer plans, and quality of care scores in both nations are in most cases better. Prioritize this trend for two reasons. First, on probability. Empirically, countries with single-payer healthcare systems spend less on healthcare than the US. That means the most probable result of affirming is that spending in the US decreases as well. But secondly, on evidence quality, their Blay House study cherry-picks data to write its conclusion, but still finds that Medicare for All would be beneficial. As Hillkick 19 writes that in 2018, Blay House issued a study purporting to show that Medicare for All would result in massive increases in federal spending. However, Blay House calculations show that the program would reduce national health expenditures by $2 trillion, despite offering more Americans healthcare services. But even then, Blay House's analysis focused on Medicare for All would affect the federal budget without stressing that much of it would be redistribution of money that's already being laid out. That allowed him to make the cost of Medicare for All seem a lot scarier. But then on the impact level, at first you can cross-apply our second contingent here. We solve in two ways. The first is that it short circuits their impact. Their Walsh evidence finds that the LICs are on the verge of default amid the recession that's already happening. It's non-unique, but we say at the point where the decrease in bonds bought is the result of the recession, the only way you solve this issue is through economic stimulus that happens in an AF world. Prioritize this on probability at the point where they don't explain to you what the status quo does to solve the issue that they say is happening right now. The AF has the only risk of solvency, but secondly, no one buys bonds from other countries if they don't have capital to spend in the first place. Our third link solves for this too. Vote AF.
Okay, can you, which one? The R&D one?
No, the streamlining the debt.
Oh, yeah. Can you send us the streamlining the debt turn?
The evidence from the turn.
Okay, I just sent it.
We'll let you know when we get it. Okay, we got it. We're gonna take that. Did you guys read the Moshe Levy piece of evidence in the second turn on RC1?
Wait, sorry, what evidence?
Who is the author for the second turn you read on our first contention?
I think it was Audie, but I can find the full name.
Yeah.
I just know that's the last name.
If you could send
that
it,
over.
yeah, we'll pause and we'll wait.
Send
for
the
it.
full card.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. Okay, I just sent it.
Okay. We'll start taking prep again when we get it. I didn't get it yet.
Well, it's the same one from the beginning.
I didn't get it yet. Can you wait? Okay, yeah. All right. We're gonna take prep now. We have a minute left.
Okay. It's gonna start by frontlining our case, then go to their case. Okay. Is everyone ready? I'm gonna take that as a yes. Okay. Start on the turn, they read about how innovation is useless right now. 1, our argument is not about innovation. 2, this is predicated on an increase in profit, which I will get to on their second turn. The turn is not true. 1, because the evidence concludes that any price control above a 20% decrease would be catastrophic. And it's also not true because there's no increase in demand because the government is paying for it, not more consumers. Go to their turn on debt where they tell you that costs will be streamlined. 1, it says you decrease the cost by 450 billion, which is not even like 1/50th of the cost, like not even 1% of the cost to finance Medicare for all. And 2, you have to take out the $32 trillion to finance the plan before you can reap these savings. The time frame argument is very bad. Then on the index to Blauhaus accounts for the reallocation and decrease in healthcare spending and still says you have to take out $32 trillion in debt. Call for the evidence. It's super explicit. Then on their solvency advocacy at the bottom where they say the Walsh evidence is non-unique, the Walsh evidence is explicit that IMF loans are going to these countries right now, but if the yield rate gets higher for investors, they will not be willing to pay. Again, call for the evidence is very good. And then their capital solves back argument is very bad because of the time frame that I'll get to on their case. Off the top, they have very, very short-term solvency because the Blauhaus evidence from our case concludes that the cost of Medicare for all will only rise over time as the population ages, meaning the program inevitably crowds itself out and has to be repealed or scaled back, meaning all of their benefits are inherently short-term. With that being said, go to their first argument on rural hospital closure. Firstly, their uniqueness is bad because the HHS gives $11 million to rural hospitals for funding for the COVID crisis, which means they're not actually at bad risk of closure. Then on their first link about direct investment, 1, their evidence doesn't actually specify what kind of investment, how much is really not contextualized. 2, Alaya 25 that 70% of patients in rural hospitals have private insurance, which means on net revenue decrease. Then, even if the hospitals stay open, there's going to be no care that's actually given. Shulman 19 explains that when hospitals are paid the current Medicare reimbursement rate of 87% of cost, revenue decreases by 16%. This has 2 implications. Firstly, a doctor shortage. Newman 19 explains that since doctors enter the field with a high amount of student debt, when they see that wages and reimbursement rates are decreasing, they're going to be disincentivized to enter the field, triggering a 44,000 doctor shortage. Secondly, drug shortages. Riley finds that in 2003, when the reimbursement rate for drugs decreased, shortages increased because pharma companies could not invest in their manufacturing capability, which is terrible because shortages of just one drug lead to a 4% increase in mortality. Multiply that by thousands of drugs with a death toll in the millions. This means we prerequisite their case because even if there are hospitals, there are no doctors, no drugs, no care. Then access to healthcare in the United States trades off with access in LMCs for 2 reasons. Firstly, our contention too about drug donations. Secondly, because drug innovation for neglected diseases decreases. Hutiep finds that neglected diseases are given low priority because they occur in poor countries and offer negligible profit benefits. That's why Mazzucato quantifies that in the last decade, less than 4% of innovative drugs were for neglected diseases, which means you cut even more lifelines to the developing world. Then go to their C2 on econ. On the wages link, 2 reasons why income decreases. Firstly, Mitchell 19 explains that when taxes increase, labor workers bear 75% of the cost of that increase. Prefer this term because it analyzes the incentive of the actors. CEOs will always cut wages before they cut their own pay. Secondly, Loopy 19 explains that Sanders has admitted his plan will take away $45 billion annually from the middle class on net decreasing take-home pay. Then, where they tell you that jobs increase, 2 reasons why this doesn't happen. Firstly, Peterson 20 explains that when you increase the amount of bonds in the market, you decrease investment into small businesses because the bonds are safer and business investment is risky, meaning few businesses are started or few businesses have the opportunity to expand. Secondly, Mitchell 19 explains that when the tax rate for businesses increases as they grow, it disincentivizes hiring in the long term. Prefer these terms, firstly on uniqueness, because there are millions of stimulus packages we could pass to help the US economy. Medicare for all uniquely makes it worse. And secondly, on time frame, because these are like long-term effects of the Medicare for all bill, whereas we can rebound from a recession in either world. Then on their argument specifically about the COVID recession, Medicare for all has a 5-year phase-in. Their time frame solvency is very bad, especially if they're trying to implicate it to the developing world where the increase in the yield rates affects investment immediately. Then we would say specifically our argument outweighs on time frame because the Walsh evidence from case finds that once these countries default, you cannot own bonds from them, meaning you doom them to long-term poverty. Ready for cross whenever.
Yeah, let me pull up my timer.
Sounds good.
Okay. How much does price caps account to? Like what percentage is it in an AF world?
Seeing as you're the ones advocating for price controls, I think you should tell me.
Wait, that's your link though, isn't it? Like they lose profit in an AF world, so it is your link.
Okay, well, the sued evidence from our case finds that revenue for pharma companies will decrease by 20% in like a
Wait, so if it decreases by 20%, how is your response applicable? Because you say any increase, like any decrease over 20%, but at the point where your own evidence says it's 20%, that just increases the market. So that means more people are buying the drugs, they have more profit, they can donate more to the developing world.
It'll compound over time.
Wait, explain that, please.
They lose profit over time because when you're like continually selling drugs at a 20% like decrease from when you were originally selling it, you're going to make less profit in the long run than you would have in a world without this price cap.
But if 23% more people can buy the drug, how is that still true?
What?
23% more people can buy the drug when there's a 20% decrease in prices, right? That means the market expands. That means more people are buying the product. That makes up for losses.
I still think that like it's going to decrease profits more in the long run because again, if you're selling it like substantially at a capped price, you have less revenue than you would in a world without it. Can I get a question?
Sure.
Okay, so on your contention too about the economy, right?
Yeah.
So your third link is about consumer spending, right? And that a boost in wages is going to like make the economy better, right?
Wait, that's not our third link. Our third link doesn't have to do with wages.
Okay, so what is your third link then? Because
basically when people don't have to pay for medical care anymore, they have more money to put into the economy.
Oh, okay. So it's predicated on like medical expenses going down, right?
Yeah.
Okay, but isn't paying a tax to pay for your healthcare like
sure? At the point where you say that it's going to be spent through the deficit, we say none of your tax arguments are applicable.
That's not true because the Blauhaus evidence from our case concludes that you have to double all taxes and still take out trillions of dollars of debt.
Wait, I'm confused. You say it's going to cost $32 trillion, right? So are we getting that from the debt or taxes? Because you have to choose one, right? You can't go for these trends and then your C2.
No. The Blahhouse evidence is super explicit. You can read the evidence. It's at the top of our C2. It, one, accounts for a 40% decrease in the inflated cost of healthcare, and two, assumes that we double every single corporate income tax, and still concludes we have to take out 30.
Wait, how would corporate income taxes hurt the middle class? How would corporate income taxes hurt the middle class?
It decreases their wages because, as I read in the, I believe, Mitchell turn, the CEOs are always going to cut wages before they cut
but when
their
they don't
pay.
have to
And
cut.
Caroline, can I finish?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, and B, the loopy evidence concludes that the middle class is still going to be taxed $400 million annually to pay for it.
Wait, so there's corporate taxes, there's deficit spending, and then there's payroll taxes as well?
Yes.
Okay, then how, like, doesn't that mitigate your impact?
Which impact? No, because you still have to take out $32 trillion, which is still an insane amount of debt. It's like a very expensive program.
We're gonna run prep.
Okay.
It's going to start on rural hospitals. Is everyone good? So on our second link of rural hospitals, the Archer evidence is really explicit that once you increase the amount of insured patients going to these rural hospitals, you're going to increase compensation for the hospitals. That's because there are a lot of uninsured patients that are going into these hospitals, and the hospitals are having to foot the bill. The second warrant in that argument is about increasing preventative care is going to decrease the large bills in the long term, so hospitals aren't going to have to pay as much. That's how we get to the Ballantine evidence. It says COVID has spiral closures out of control, and LaPointe says that just one closure increases mortality 9%. They make a couple responses. First, at the top, they say that programs are going to be crowded out by high debt, but programs aren't crowded out by high debt ever before. We're $21 trillion in debt. Make them give specific reasons why specifically healthcare spending would be crowded out. Then they tell you that we just got a stimulus package for $11 million for COVID relief, but it isn't enough in the long term, and it's not responsive to the Archer evidence, because what he tells you is that hospitals are closing because of uncompensated care. Stimulus checks aren't enough to those hospitals in the long term because there's going to be uncompensated care in the long term. Then they make a turn about current reimbursement rates being low. But first, when you take global budgeting into account, Ty says actually reimbursement go 110% to the current rates. Then they say that there's going to be a doctor shortage, but our Archer evidence says that actually administrative time is going to go down, so doctors are going to have more time per patient. That has two implications. The first is that when they have more time per patient, their salaries will go up per time, but second is that they have more time, then it decreases the amount of doctors needed in the first place. Then they tell you there's a drug shortage, but our hospital's argument prereqs their doctor shortage, drug shortage, and prereq, because a drug or doctor shortage doesn't matter if there's no facilities to facilitate any of these arguments in. Then they tell you that we need to prioritize the low-income countries' diseases, but currently Hafner finds that only 1% of this innovation actually goes to diseases for low-income countries. They're not solving in the status quo. Then on their turns about taxes, it doesn't apply to the point where they go for the Playhouse evidence that says it's only spent for deficit on small businesses. It's non-unique. Businesses are decreasing because of COVID. Now no one's innovating. Now let's go into their C2 about debt. The SLPD evidence is really important. That's for two reasons. First, it indicts their own Playhouse evidence that concludes for y'all to vote F. But second, they tell you it's a 4-year phase-in on our case. That means that immediately we're not spending this huge number of debt, so their arguments don't take place until 4 years later. Then here's where you vote the round. The Daresh evidence goes completely untouched from our case, which is a meta-analysis of 20 different studies that finds in the long term, this is going to cost a lot less. This turns their case on evidence. We would say that you prioritize Daresh because it's a meta-analysis, and because their Playhouse, the only link evidence in this round, says that Medicare for all should be passed. Then on the IMF stuff, they tell you that 1/3 of revenue currently goes to paying interest rates on debt in the developing world. That means poverty already exists. The risk of solvency is in the app for like any economic stimulus, but we would say to the point where we're winning that it's going to cost a lot less, and the 9% increase in mortality is the only reversible impact in this round, or irreversible impact in this round. It's a really clear ballot for rural hospitals.
We'll take some prep time as soon as I get a timer going.
Can you mute on your computer?
Yeah.
I like all of this one.
Okay. So, sorry, I'm getting my timer open. The order is going to be our C2 on debt some way, and then their argument about rural hospitals. Okay. Is everyone ready? Okay. They extend 2 responses on our C2 and next summary. The first thing to say is the Blockhouse evidence is bad because it says M3 is good for the healthcare system, but the Blockhouse evidence, even though it says there might be some marginal increases in healthcare access, does say that overall the negative economic benefits are not good. Then their next response says that it doesn't account for the reduction of costs in the long term by $400 billion, but the Blockhouse evidence does explicitly account for this. Literally read the 2 cards in the case we sent. It says that even if you double all federal and corporate income taxes and you account for the 40% reduction in costs from the currently inflated healthcare costs in the status quo, you still need to take out $32.6 trillion over the next 10 years to finance the plan because healthcare spending will be $50 trillion in the next decade. This means you still have to take out literally trillions of dollars in debt every single year to finance the plan, which is more money in debt than the United States has ever taken out, aside from the CARES Act in March, which is the largest spending package ever, which means the scope of our argument is much larger than any mitigation they get about saving costs in the long term. That means their next response is there's no risk of solvency because people are already in poverty in the long term. Our argument is that reversibility of the economic harms insofar as the Walsh evidence finds that once countries default, their access to international markets is destroyed because their credit ratings are ruined and their ability for investors to buy their bonds is literally illegal because large hedge funds are not allowed to buy defaulted bonds, which means the only way to actually have the ability to solve the economic crisis and avoid the economic crisis is to maintain the status quo, which means you can very cleanly vote on our link on our C2. Insofar as the Blockhouse evidence finds you need to take out debt to finance, you have to raise the yield rate on the bonds in order to get investors who buy the bonds. Further evidence finds uniquely and is conceded that yield rates have to increase at M3 to incentivize investors who buy the bonds. Sester finds that when yields in the United States increase, yields in low and middle income countries have to increase to compete with the safer U.S. bonds. When these yields increase, it makes it harder for them to pay back their investors on the yield rates, pushing them into default. This is empirically happened in the past. We conceded Jones evidence finds that in the 80s, when the same thing happened with high United States yields and yields in high income countries and low income countries increased, they fell into default, and 125 million people fell into long-term extreme poverty as a result. This is a few reasons. First of all, in scope. Our argument is much larger and insofar as put people into 100 countries into default in the long term. And our argument is much worse than their marginal decrease in mortality from rural hospitals. But second of all, in time frame, their argument about this happens in a 4-year phase-in, and rural hospitals are being helped in the status quo with the CARES Act, which shows that the only ability to actually solve for our problem and debt default is to vote con and avoid this problem. But thirdly, on magnitude, literally billions of people falling into poverty long-term economic crash is way worse than having some marginal decrease in healthcare quality in the United States in the short term. That means we literally always outweigh their arguments on reversibility because econ reversibility and long-term harms is worse than reversibility of healthcare. On their side of the flow, their argument doesn't matter insofar as the Health and Human Services gave $11 billion to rural hospitals, and Life says that overall net reimbursement rates will decrease because rural hospitals treat 70% of privately insured patients, insofar as privately insured patients are where most of the money comes from. Net reimbursement decrease, meaning the solvency of their is really low, and the way analysis on reversibility definitely goes to con, meaning it's always a con ballot.
Okay, are y'all ready for Grand?
Sorry, my computer was muted. We're good for cross.
Okay. Let's start on the IMF evidence. In your impact, it says that 1/3 of current revenue from developing countries is going to pay off interest.
Right.
How much more does it increase?
So when yields increase, they have to pay more of the revenue. It's a scalar impact. So as yields continue to increase, the revenue they pay continues to increase. It's not linear. But second of all, our argument is about the ability to solve. The ability to solve for the crisis is literally just destroyed when you vote pro and push them into default, which means even though there might be some marginal cuts and the marginal cuts get worse in your world, the ability to solve is just destroyed.
Okay, I was just wondering if there was any clarity about how many more people are getting pushed into poverty since they're already paying high interest rates.
Historically, the last time, this is the conceded Jones evidence that says historically the last time a region went into default, 120 million or 25.
Right, I'm just wondering when they will go into default.
So our argument is that they are not in default right now and can avoid default because they have investor confidence, some small shred left, but that investor confidence is ruined when you increase the yield rates. This is conceded evidence.
Wait, it's an argument predicated on investor confidence?
No, it's not just investor confidence, but when yield rates increase, that destroys their ability to finance their recovery right now.
Okay.
Yeah, and you haven't like contested that so far. So
We've
like,
kind of
yeah.
contested like the White House evidence a lot, but yeah.
no, but that's the
Yeah.
rest of our link chain you haven't
Also-
contested.
Yeah, you all can get a question.
Okay, sure. Let's talk about your rural hospitals argument, right? So you're telling me that like, actually, no, I don't have a question. Claire, do you have a question?
Sure. So your argument is that, can you just explain the 110 reimbursement rate thing? I
Yeah.
got that like empiric, but I didn't understand the catch-up warrants.
Okay, so the current Medicare reimbursement rate is what your evidence says. It's 87 cents to the dollar, but Ty says is that once you take in the new provisions of the Medicare for All bill, like global budgeting, then it's functionally a 110% reimbursement.
Really quickly, was this tie evidence from rebuttal, or was this the evidence from your case that says there's like increased funding?
No, the Ty evidence is how we frontlined your reimbursement turn.
Okay.
Our case doesn't predicate on reimbursements.
Okay, but your case does predicate on like increased like funding going to rural
Yeah,
hospitals.
like generally funding going to rural hospitals, yeah.
But your
Well,
case
like-
evidence doesn't say global budgeting, right? So where does your advocacy shift from like this nebulous like investment idea to global budgeting?
That was an answer to reimbursements. We're not talking about global budgeting in case. Our evidence says is that when you
Is the link
amount of insured people, then there's more compensated care, but also that when you increase preventative care, bills are smaller in the long term.
real quick, is the link in your case different than the global budgeting like link /
Yeah.
frontline?
Yeah, it was
Okay.
a differently determined with the reimbursement rates.
Yeah.
Your reimbursement rate thing wasn't responsible.
Yeah,
We just
okay,
wanted
we
to
got it.
clarify. We're good.
Okay. It's going to be the AF, the neg. Is everybody ready? Awesome. Start with the Archer evidence. It tells you that by increasing the amount of patients who have insurance, it prevents hospitals from having to foot the bill like they do in the status quo. That's really important. It increases revenue for hospitals across the board. That's really important because 36 million Americans depend on rural hospitals, and each closure increases mortality for those Americans by 9%. They have a couple of responses. First, they said that there was just an $11 million stimulus check, but it doesn't solve the root of the issue, which is the inability for hospitals to actually fund themselves because they're having to foot the bill for their uninsured. At best, it's a band-aid solution. We know it doesn't work because they're still collapsing. But secondly, they say that reimbursement rates would decrease. But at the point they don't respond to the CHI evidence that says that global budgeting would functionally increase reimbursement rates by 110%, this response doesn't even matter. Don't let them respond to this evidence. And final, they don't do it in summary. But secondly, it's just empirically not true. The callback evidence says that because these are people in rural areas, they're more likely to be in poverty. They can't afford private insurance in the first place. But then third, it isn't even responsive to the link. It doesn't matter in this round. At that point, you have a really, really clear way to vote for the AF over rural hospitals. But then you can go on to their case where we tell you, where we give you the SLPD evidence that says that Medicare for All would reduce the debt by streamlining the process and getting rid of all of the different administration costs that make up 31% of all healthcare spending in the status quo. They extend the Blay House evidence, but they never specifically respond to the insight. We see that Blay House is ignoring the fact and just isn't acknowledging the fact that most of the cost is just going to be redistributed from what it does now. That allows him to make the cost look a lot scarier than it actually is. Prefer our evidence over his. Theirs is really, really bad, and it cherry picks the data. That means that bond yields don't increase in our world. At that point, we link in better to the developing world already. But then on their impact, we say that poverty already exists. They don't say how these countries are getting out of poverty in the first place. This impact is really non-unique. But then they have this weighing about the time frame. They say it's going to take a long time for ours to phase in, but that's the same for them. We're not going to spend $32 trillion all at once. The time period is exactly the same, but there's a couple reasons you prioritize us. First is on reversibility. You would always bring people back out of poverty. You can't bring back the lives lost due to closure, but then on urgency, COVID has exacerbated closures. Solving the issue needs to happen first. You can invest in the developing world later. You have to vote AF now.
We're gonna run the remaining bit of our prep.
Okay.
On the boss.
It's gonna go our case weighing their case. Okay. Everyone ready? On the Blahhaus evidence, they make this analysis from the SLPD that there's going to be a decrease in the debt, but realize this decrease in spending happens after you pass the program, meaning you actually have to spend the money to take out the debt to fund the program before there is this streamlining of expenses that actually solves back. At that point, the only response they have is that the Blahhaus evidence is very bad, but I implore you to call for this evidence. It's very explicit that you have to double every single corporate and federal income tax, and you still have to take out $32 trillion in debt to fund. Call it. It's a great piece of evidence. At that point, our link chain is very, very clear that when you take out this debt, Schrager finds that uniquely with a risky long-term spending program like Medicare for All, you have to increase the yield rates to actually incentivize investors to pay for this. That's critical because Sester concludes that when you increase the yield rates on US bonds, developing world countries have to also increase their yield rates to compete with US bonds, which makes it harder for them to pay off their own debt. At that point, they are pushed into a default, which historically the conceded Jones evidence finds pushed 120 million people or 25 million people into poverty the last time it happened. They give two pieces of weighing. Firstly, that the time frame is bad, these people won't go into poverty instantly, but realize the moment you start taking off this debt, you have to raise the yield rates to like actually incentivize people to start buying it. It happens instantly. Then they give you this irreversibility weighing. One, no people are going to die in their world insofar as they can see the HHS evidence saying $11 billion is being given to rural hospitals right now to stop them from closing, meaning their impact like doesn't really happen. And two, the scope of our argument and the time frame is much larger insofar as the again conceded Walsh analysis finds that once these countries go into a default, like investors are contractually prohibited from owning their bonds, meaning they will never recover from this long-term poverty. At that point, you look to our way, which explains that a default in these countries is far worse. Firstly, on scope, because it's literally 100 countries as opposed to their US-centric impact. And secondly, on magnitude, because the long-term irreversible poverty is going to be very much worse than any nebulous increase in mortality in the United States. On their case, remember the HHS evidence, which says rural hospitals are given $11 billion right now. Their solvency and uniqueness is very bad. And we'd say that revenue on net goes down because there are a lot of privately insured rural people. Revenue will on net decrease. Good round, guys.
Good round, y'all.
Great.
Oh, y'all, sorry.
I'm looking at the cut of Black